Welcome. This is a reference video in which I will be addressing the morality is subjective argument. Feel free to link to this video anytime somebody deploys it. And if you've deployed it, hello. I will now explain to you how you've just performed the intellectual equivalent of shooting yourself in the face.
You know morality is subjective, right?
The morality is subjective argument is deployed as a defense whenever someone is cornered on a topic and accused of advocating something immoral. This knee-jerk response functionally amounts to forfeiting the debate, yet perpetrators almost universally fail to understand how and where they went wrong. The problem lies in the vague premises, which I will now deconstruct. Both objective and subjective operate in two relevant senses, epistemologically and ontologically. The ontological definitions describe what morality is, whether it exists independently of a subject, or whether its existence is dependent on a subject. The epistemological definitions describe how morality is known, whether it's understood through an impartial consideration of facts, or whether it's understood through a partial consideration of feelings. Now, it is true to say that morality is ontologically subjective, but so is this video. Literally everything you're experiencing right now is ontologically subjective, because everything you can know is limited by your subjective ability to know. This could be a simulation. I could wake you up.
Easy, Neo. Easy.
This is the only sense in which the claim can be said to be absolutely true, yet it is the least relevant to the conversation. Can I refute all of your claims, because everything you assert is ontologically subjective? If yes, I win. If no, you lose, because now you've contradicted yourself, and if you attempt to extend the truth of this statement morality is subjective from an ontological premise to an epistemological conclusion, then you've just committed an equivocation fallacy. Solipsism is the intellectual gutter of philosophy. It serves no purpose but to deny the world long enough to win arguments. The only reality I'm concerned with is the one in which we're arguing. Now you know you got a real genius on your hands when they say,
yeah, well, that's just like, your opinion, man.
For some reason, these people believe a mere difference of opinion is evidence in and of itself that there can be no right or wrong answers. I cannot even begin to describe how utterly stupefying this lack of self-awareness is. Even if I were to be charitable enough to assume that they were proponents of science, they would have just detonated it along with every other possible concept any two people could ever disagree on.
And no one ever attacks the philosophical underpinnings of medicine with doubts about, how can you say that smallpox isn't healthy? What would you say to a man dying of smallpox who thinks he's as healthy as you are? How could you convince him? You don't have to convince him. What do you do with a skeptic about water chemistry? No chemist would be burdened with the task of saying, well, if I just can't convince that guy, well, it's maybe there's no truth to chemistry.
Now that the ontological interpretation of the claim has been summarily refuted, let's consider the epistemological interpretation. Inexplicably, it seems people get caught up on the initial phrasing of the claim, morality is subjective. I'm sorry, but how can you claim to know that every moral system is epistemologically subjective? Are you omniscient? No, clearly this statement needs some work. We can correct it to say that morality can be subjective, and or my morality is subjective. Both of these statements can be true. In the case of the first, we are merely acknowledging that there are different moral systems, and that some of them are epistemologically subjective. In the case of the second, we are proving the first by stating that our moral system, in specific, is epistemologically subjective. I will concede to both of these claims. Moral systems can be epistemologically subjective, and yours is one of them. However, now that we've established that, let's actually consider the hypothetical merits of such a system. An epistemologically subjective moral system is one in which right and wrong is determined by the moral agent's personal biases, opinions, and feelings. In other words, what is moral is entirely subject to you, and what you value. This is where I think people fundamentally lose the arguments, because even surface-level scrutiny reveals this prescription to be absurd in the utmost extreme. What you value could be anything, and if right and wrong is subject to you, then a subjective morality is nothing if not the world's biggest blank check to commit any atrocity that you could possibly endorse on a whim. Suddenly genocide is as easy to justify as, because I felt like it. Hey Conan, what's best in life?
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, they hear the lamentation of the women.
Aw yeah, let's put that guy in charge. I see good things coming out of him. It should be transparently obvious why an epistemologically subjective morality is a bad idea. Much as we might think ourselves fine kings, we wouldn't want to bend knee to one. Would you subscribe to a morality based on my values and what I think is right or wrong? Of course not, so why should anyone subscribe to yours? Now this is where people go, but I'm not asking anyone to subscribe to mine. In which case, it would appear your morality serves no other purpose than to describe what you feel about any given thing at any given time, which is about the most vacuous retort you could give to somebody presenting you objective reasons for what is right or wrong. I mean, let's remove the word moral from the conversation and use legal instead. The conflict is no less absurd. Now somebody's giving you objective reasons for why something should or should not be legal, and all you can say is, but I'm not trying to tell you what should be legal. That's beside the point. And if your point is to say that your idea of what should be legal or what should be moral is epistemologically subjective, and that it is predicated on your feelings rather than facts, then I'm afraid you've lost the argument. The case for subjective morality is riddled with more holes than Swiss cheese. It's fallacy compounded on greater fallacy. When it's not a conflation of terms, it's an equivocation of terms. When it's not an absolute statement couched in vague premises, it's a self-contradicting one which distracts from the topic at hand. In my view, deploying the morality subjective arguments is worse than admitting you're wrong, because it conveys to me a dangerous negligence towards screening your beliefs.
Maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky! On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
Okay, so, what did we learn?
Now, while I believe what I've said so far should be sufficient to stir skepticism in any reasonably intelligent onlooker, let's also consider the logic underpinning an objective morality. Right off, we can discount an objective morality in the ontological sense, for there is no evidence for it. To assert that morality exists apart from ourselves would be akin to asserting the existence of God, and in fact, the two are generally considered to be one and the same.
Without a God who is the source of morality, morality is just a matter of opinion.
Let us leave the religion debate for another day and skip straight on into an epistemologically objective morality. An epistemologically objective morality is a moral system which can be considered objective in the epistemological sense of the word. For some reason, people still have tremendous difficulty in recognizing this important distinction, so I will try one last time here to make this point absolutely clear. We refer to God as objective in the ontological sense, in that it exists physically independently of our subjective observation. We refer to science as objective in the epistemological sense, and that it operates, conceptually, independently of our subjective opinions. They are both objective in theory, yet per their different definitions they are fundamentally antithetical in practice. Hopefully this elucidates just how significant a difference between these two uses of the term objective I am making here. When we refer to the objectivity of science, we're not talking about science as an object. We're talking about science as a method, one which attempts to carve out the fallible human elements as much as possible. This isn't to say that we disregard human subjectivity, but that we take it into account in a manner which most reliably tracks with observable reality. So what does this mean as a moral system? Well, one thing we can say for certain is that it cannot be beholden to any one person. And that really makes sense if we actually consider what we mean by the word morality. When we stop at defining morality as what is right or wrong, we aren't really producing a comprehensive definition. Right, wrong, good, and bad are all value judgments, and we use these value judgments to inform our behavior and the behavior of those around us. But these are not absolute statements, and I'm not advocating any form of moral absolutism. Rather, we can make objective value judgments based on relative circumstances, and in fact, I would argue, we must. I have a favorite analogy that I like to use to demonstrate this point. Suppose I present to you a spoon entirely out of context. Is the spoon good or bad? If your mind immediately wanders to what you can do with the spoon, you've just made my point. You must first impose context onto the spoon before you can determine its value. Now suppose I tasked you with the job of digging a grave. Is the spoon good or bad? Well, relative to ruining your hands, the spoon is an objective good insofar as it serves the purpose of digging graves. But now suppose I offer you a choice between a spoon and a shovel. Is the spoon good or bad? Clearly we must weight our value judgments proportional to the differential advantage that each option provides. A carriage may well have been a sublime means of travel a few centuries ago, but today it must compete with the motor vehicle. This isn't to say that we can't arrive at different conclusions by different premises, however. While a shovel may be optimal for digging a grave, it's certainly suboptimal for eating a bowl of cereal. We all understand this basic concept of relative utility, but can we draw moral conclusions from this? I think it's safe to say that if you were to go out onto the street and randomly poll people on whether they found somebody's choice of eating utensil to be a question of morality, you would quite conclusively find unanimous disagreement. Understanding this to excise the well-being of someone making a personal choice, and provided we are leaving aside the otherwise unfounded claims of divine judgment, it should be apparent to all that morality is a concern for our behavior towards others, specifically, others who have values. This is reflected in nearly every society's most basic laws. Theft, fraud, and violence are not condemned for infringing on the interests of the perpetrator, but for infringing on the interests of the victim. We establish these rules morally and legally to protect the interests of others. This necessarily implies, of course, that others, to be of moral concern, must have interests, that is, the capacity to value things. This is where sentience enters the equation. However, I will table the discussion over marginal degrees of sentience for another time. Suffice it to say, sentience is a necessary component to moral human interaction. Now, before we conclude with our definition, allow me to call your mind back to an earlier part of the video where I said morality cannot be beholden to any one person. I hope I've made it abundantly clear by this point why this must be the case. Granting moral authority to any individual person would create a literal conflict of interest, in much the same way as granting legal authority would. The solution to both is the same: overthrow the king and democratize the people. But everyone has different interests, you say. How can you satisfy one without infringing on another? You can't. Which is why we must limit the scope of our moral systems, just as we must limit the scope of our legal systems, to that which is held most universally. You value your life, your health, your bodily autonomy, and I bet you wouldn't want to be a victim of theft, fraud, or violence. The overwhelming majority of people on this planet share these values, and so it is with the respect for these values that we can most reliably affect a moral system which transcends national, cultural, and even language barriers.
You can still use logical reasoning, and you can still take a type of scientific method, trying to decide what kind of world you want to live in, and work on it like that. Weighing different scenarios, for example. One where everybody is allowed to murder each other versus a situation where nobody is allowed to do it. And which world would you want to live in?
Let us marshal all of these shared values together into one convenient category, and let us call it well-being. I believe we finally have a more comprehensive definition. Morality is the state or quality of being in conformity with a moral system. A moral system is a set of interpersonal behaviors which protect the well-being of sentient creatures by their observance. It has taken us a while to get to this point, but only, I believe, because we have collectively bought into the morality subjective narrative and failed to draw parallels to legality, which at times seems only distinguishable from morality by name. This is neither the first time nor the last time I will say this, but question everything. Employ reductio ad absurdum indiscriminately, and screen your beliefs judiciously. Finally, let's take care of the moral subjectivist's last resort, Hume's law, also known as the naturalistic fallacy, the fact-value distinction, or the is-ought problem. The argument usually runs as follows. You can't derive an ought from an is. That is to say that a description of facts is not a prescription of values. That information about the world tells you nothing about what to do with that information. This, in actual fact, is a true statement. However, it is not a refutation. I refer you to page 92 of Joseph L. de Leiden's 1998 book, The Science of Morality. The key to resolving the dichotomy between statements of fact and normative statements of how we should behave is the introduction of a hybrid statement that I call a contingent statement. A contingent statement is of the form, if we want X, then we must do Y. If we want to be happy, we must act in this manner. Such a statement doesn't say that we should be happy, but it does say that if we want to be happy, this is how we should behave. The kind of behavior most conducive to happiness can be investigated empirically, and therefore is the proper subject matter for science. It is implicit in the meta-ethical theory of Bentham and Mill. Moreover, despite his earlier insistence on the distinction between ethical sentiments and factual statements, in a later work Hume states that although moral sentiments offer some basis for ethical behavior, the question of morals can be resolved empirically, with a system of ethics founded solidly on fact and observation. You heard that right. It's just that simple. We already have values, facts only inform how best to pursue them. And yes, David Hume, who posited the famous is-ought problem in 1739, would go on and contradict this appeal to subjectivity just 12 years later. Men are now cured of their passion for hypotheses and systems in natural philosophy, and will hearken to no arguments but those which are derived from experience. It is full time they attempt a like reformation in all moral disquisitions, and reject every system of ethics, however subtle or ingenious, which is not founded on fact and observation. Let's be real. It's not as if I needed de Leyden or Hume to make this point either. Saying science can't tell us what to do quite obviously doesn't stop us from asking science what to do. Not only have we put the final nail in the coffin, but we've buried it 6 feet under with the owner's shovel. You chose the shovel, right? Finally, I think it's time we close out this video. Next time somebody pulls this argument on you, link them here, and save yourself the time of arguing with them. And if any masochists would like to see their argument ground even further into the dirt, I recommend this video featuring Sam Harris, his book, The Moral Landscape, and especially The Science of Morality by Joseph L. de Leyden. All will be linked in the description. Thank you very much for listening.
What, do you figure that every human concept is somehow a fundamental property of the universe? Hey, what's a metaphor? Oh, a metaphor is a figure of speech that refers to one thing by mentioning another. Stop right there! What photographs or measurable data or instruments can you provide to prove that? That's you right now. That's how you sound.